everyone. I hope y'all are doing well and having a great day. I just wanted to say good evening, everyone. I am Jay Jones, the 64th Howard University Student Association Executive President, and want to say thank you all so much for coming to today's conversation about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and LGBTQ plus equality today. Today, we find ourselves in a rapid shift of our national culture, values, and identity, from the political rhetoric that has echoed across the country to the very fabric of our everyday lives. There has been a notable transformation that has impacted how we perceive ourselves, our neighbors, and our roles in a rapidly changing world. Only 1 week into Trump's administrations, Black, Brown, and LGBTQ plus Americans have been at the forefront of an attack on DEI initiatives, immigration, transgender service members, and the list continues as new executive orders and initiatives are announced. Now is not the time to stand idly as our nation crumbles before us. This conversation not only serves as a platform to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in a new political world that has forever changing rules. Joining us today, we are excited to welcome Stacey Abrams, the Ronald W. Walters Chair for Race and Black Politics. In here, also joining us in this conversation is President of the Human Rights Campaign, Kelley Robinson, and a champion of LGBTQ rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
All right. And drop off this in here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is my honor to be here today. I want to acknowledge the Executive Director of the Walters Center. And I am so glad to be back on campus. I thought we'd be having a slightly different conversation this year, but, you know, we got another shot. There's always another shot. And one of the reasons for today's conversation is that we knew that in the wake of the November elections, the Project 2025 intention to be made. Worse, we knew that one of their key targets was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you've been to any of our previous conversations in the speaker series, we know they don't like DEI because they hate diversity, they are afraid of equity, and they revile inclusion. And when I say they, I am talking about anyone who thinks that the actions taken by this administration and the passage of these executive orders is right. But don't just take my word for it. I am delighted to be here with Kelley Robinson, in part because she is the leader of an organization that has been not only on the front lines of fighting for DEI, but really helping shape strategy around how we make certain that diversity, equity, and inclusion, that DEI is embedded in how our lived experiences exist. And so I'm going to start with you. The first question I'm going to start with is, what is DEI and why do you care?
All right. Well, first I have to say thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Madam President Jay Jones. Good to see you. Yeah. And I love that you started there. What is diversity, equity, and inclusion all about? Because I think that it has really been weaponized by our opposition. They somehow want us to believe that DEI is a threat to a meritocracy that, let's be honest, never existed in the United States of America. They want us to believe that DEI is a threat to companies actually thriving in the world, when in fact we know that it's been a key factor in how companies have gotten so good and so wealthy and so powerful in this country. So we've got to do a lot of work to kind of reset the record. At the Human Rights Campaign, we've been partnering with corporations for the last 20 years around their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts through a program we call the Corporate Equality Index. And that's always been meant to be a tool, a roadmap for businesses about how you get from where you are to where you want to be, creating inclusive policies. And it's through that tool that we were able to get things like non-discrimination in the workplace before Bostock became the Supreme Court law that was the rule of the land, ensuring that LGBTQ plus people could be protected in the workplace. It's through that work that we were able to get family formation benefits like IVF that not only support the LGBTQ plus community, but support all communities. It's through this work that we've been able to do things like make sure that the couple that's been together, the lesbian couple that's been together for 20 years gets the same spousal benefits at work as the couple that went off to Vegas this weekend and got married, right? That's what this is all about. It is about creating equal ground in the workplace, about ensuring equal pay for equal work. So when I think about these attacks against DEI, I really do understand it to be a dog whistle, because what they're talking about is exactly what they're saying out loud. Make America great again. And we all know what they're talking about when they say that, don't we? This is about dismantling the civil rights infrastructure of this country that we've built over the last 60 years. So we have to take these threats for what they are. They are not just about diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. They are about a fundamental erosion of the very values of this democracy.
So when we talk about those three words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's start with diversity. Part of the narrative is that diversity only refers to Black and brown people and gay folks. That's it. So can you talk a bit about who is actually included in the term diversity in DEI?
Absolutely. It's about everyone. And again, I think that the fundamental premise of a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we have seen in businesses has been about how do I get access to the best talent in the workforce? And how do I ensure that the products I'm creating actually get to the consumers that have the resources to spend to buy them? This is not some sort of moral high ground that businesses have been on. This has been about companies trying to make money. And let's also take some of the facts into account. If you look over the last 4 or 5 years, especially starting in 2020, when after the horrendous murder of George Floyd, you saw a lot of companies be publicly pressured into investing in their diversity, equity, inclusion work. And look, there's a lot of critique I think we can say about what those companies' investments look like, the results in it being able to be ripped away so easily now. But just look at that point. From 2020 until now, you have seen a dramatic increase in the stock prices of these companies. You've seen an increase in the GDP of the United States of America. That is a result of companies finding the best talent, understanding the impact to the bottom line, and then pursuing it. So right now, I think that we have to, again, to your first point, take the narrative back, reclaim the idea that actually DEI is fundamentally about getting to a meritocracy, right? Where everyone has access to the jobs and opportunities that they fought for and worked for.
Equity. That's the second one. So you and I have both been in conversations recently where people say, well, we believe in the diversity piece and we'll deal with inclusion, but equity isn't fair. We don't really believe in equity. And I recently had a conversation with Kenji Yoshino, who said, talent is everywhere. Opportunity is not. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why folks who say equity is the wrong approach, why they are absolutely wrong and we should tell them to shut up?
Let me share some names with you. Pete Hegseth, right? I mean, the whole idea that they somehow think that this administration is putting forward the best talent possibly available is just a total fallacy, right? It is clearly not about equity. You know, when you think about that Supreme Court case decision in 2023, I'm sure y'all remember this, the affirmative action case that really did dismantle protections, particularly in institutions of higher ed, related to equity, related to admissions. Now, a lot of companies interpreted that very much in a conservative way that they should not have and doesn't apply, and carried some of that into the business space. And I bring that up because in that particular example, they want to have all kinds of opinions about admissions policies. But what they don't want to talk about is how legacy admissions are actually the discriminatory factor when you're talking about admissions to campuses, right? And who that benefits. They want to talk about how we're creating a meritocracy, but what they don't want to talk about is how Black women are the most educated demographic in this country, getting 70% of the associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, and yet we represent 0 of Fortune 500 CEOs. Make it make sense. If this was a meritocracy, the math just wouldn't math on that. So I think that we're really at a point when we think about equity, of understanding the fundamental flaws in the construction of America that has allowed us to believe that there is a meritocracy, because there simply is not. And I know everyone in this room, what do our parents always tell you? You got to work twice as hard to get what? Half as much, right? That is the definition of what we are learning, right? That teaches us this is not a meritocracy. So when you talk about equity, again, I have to bring it back to this is fundamentally about actually fighting for the values of this nation to be embodied in the way that we treat one another.
See, this is why I like talking to you. The third one, inclusion. And we have seen this be weaponized more than almost anything else. They give lip service to it. But we know that there is an attempt right now. Let's start with the fact that they fired the first woman to be the commandant of the Coast Guard, that they are pulling back on accessibility so that those who rely on the Americans with Disabilities Act, that they will not have protections. The issue of inclusion, the treatment that we are seeing for the transgender members of the military. Talk about why inclusion is such a vital part of DEI.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think it goes back to that adage that if we're not on the table, we're on the menu, right? Inclusion is about making sure that we are actually able to get access to these spaces that sometimes we don't even know exist. Now, I also think that when you think about inclusion, that is actually one of the spaces where I think that there's a lot of room to bring people in. Because people fundamentally in America don't like the idea of discrimination when you say it out loud. Right now, 70% of the country believes that it is a bad thing to discriminate against people based on their gender identity or their sexual orientation. 70%. And although that may not seem remarkable because y'all are like, well, what about that other 30%? What are they saying at home? But there's not a lot that 70% of Americans agree on, period. So it does kind of say something. And as we've watched some of the attacks from the administration play out in these very early days, I think you have examples of inclusion showing up that have actually given concrete examples of how our country has gotten stronger. So when Pete Hegseth was doing his confirmation hearings for the Secretary of Defense, one of the things that he's really been criticized for is saying that women should not be included in the armed services, that LGBTQ plus people shouldn't be able to serve. And people really pushed back on that about what it would mean to remove women from the armed services, how that would be less ready and less lethal as an American military institution. There's a lot of room there, I think, to bring case of where right now you're seeing a lot of the administrative actions just try to simply push us out by edict in ways that I really think we have to challenge whether or not they are constitutional or legal at all.
Which gets me to the next section of questions. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the executive orders and what they mean and what they don't mean. And I know you and your team are spending a lot of time really parsing through them. Would love to have you just sort of riff about why those executive orders matter so much.
Yeah.
And why they don't.
Yes. And I would love your riffs too, Professor.
Yes.
I will say there have been hundreds of executive orders in the last week. Sometimes I wake up and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's only been 7 or 8 days of this administration, right? And then other days I wake up and I say, whew, we've already made it through 7 or 8 days of this administration, because it's a lot. And we have to remember that the chaos is by design. What they are trying to do is throw so much at us that we become exhausted, that we give up hope, that people start to comply with laws and policies that are unconstitutional. So I think a lot of the work that we're doing right now at the Human Rights Campaign is about separating fact from fiction, making clear what is true and what is not true in these executive orders, about making it clear that no executive order can override our constitutional rights to things like equal protection. No executive order can override a federal statute that exists. No executive order can give the president the powers that are actually conferred by Congress. So right now, what they're doing is really testing their limits to see what people will comply with. And just today I saw that Google, they went ahead and updated their map to say that the Gulf of Mexico will now be the Gulf.
They changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico.
They did. It says that, but only for people in the United States. So now, if we open Google, it says Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. And what that shows us is how powerful pre-compliance can be around laws that have not changed, around names of places that have not changed. So I say that because that's the threat of the executive orders, that they're trying to put things out into the world that are quite frankly illegal and unconstitutional. And they're very damaging. I think right now, today, one of the most harmful things I've seen play out is this freeze on federal funding, where in some states, because of the ambiguity of the executive order, and, to be honest, president doesn't really have these powers, Medicaid funds were frozen in some states today. Disaster relief funds were frozen in some states today. Food safety programs stopped today. This is a dangerous environment that we're in, and I think really the responsibility of all of us in this room is to challenge what is true and to make sure that we're not leaning in and giving into things that simply are unconstitutional.
So one thing I saw today, and I apologize because it came out of Georgia, but Congressman Rich McCormick, he said that in response to the freeze on federal grants and loans, the reporter pointed out that would also impact school lunches.
Right.
And he said that the kids should get a job. And she pushed him on a couple of times, trying to help him walk it back. And he talked about when he used to pick raspberries or something in the field and deliver papers. And she said, we're talking about 5-year-olds. And he suggested maybe that wouldn't be necessary. But to your point, there is the difference between what the law says and what the law does. There's a difference between what an executive order can and cannot do. But there's also the question of the humanity that's embedded in these edicts. And one of the reasons I wanted you to be the person here is that you literally lead an organization referred to as the Human Rights Campaign. Not the gay rights campaign, not the LGBTQ plus campaign, but there was an intentional decision to take a core set of identity markers, but to say that we are the beginning of a larger conversation. Talk about how we meet this moment holding humanity at the center.
Wow, that was a whole word in itself. I think that is the hardest and also most important part of the work that we're doing right now. Because actually what's happening is not just laws and policies that are attacking people, it's a threat to the humanity of this country. We're once again asking ourselves the questions that, quite frankly, the founders asked too, of who is human? Who's worthy of being a citizen in this country? And I don't know about y'all, but I'm not willing to go back to the days when we were 3/5 of a person. So the stakes in this moment could not be higher. And the other thing I think that people have to understand, that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. The things that they are saying today to dehumanize the trans community, they are the same things that they said to dehumanize immigrants, right? These are the same things that they said to dehumanize people who were living with HIV and AIDS. These are the same things that they said about lesbian, gay, and bi people 40 years ago, or about Black women 100 years ago, and yet we are here. So I think that this is one of those times where, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality. It is not a theory. It's got to be a practice that we embody in everything that we do, because we are so clearly seeing how they want to try to disrupt the power of our communities by creating separation between us. And I do think that will be a challenge to put into practice as we're going through, the ways of this next administration.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few more questions, then I'm going to open it up for conversation. But before I do that, I want to get to tactics and strategy. So you and I had a good conversation today about sort of what do we do next. And one of the challenges in moments like this, you're absolutely right. Chaos is the intention. Chaos scrambles our heads, flood the zone, give us so much to think about that we can't pick out the things we actually need to pay attention to. And so we're sifting through so much that the hard stuff, the mean stuff, the things they really want to do get through, because no, you can't rescind the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. But we spend 10 minutes talking about it and we ignore the thing he can do, that actually creates harm and challenge. But the corollary there is that it's hard to then figure out what you do when you feel so small in the sea of so much trouble. And that's the place. I have a podcast called Assembly Required, and we spend a lot of time talking about what do you do when you're a person trying to fight the system? What do you do when you think that you're one cog in this larger system? One of the core leadership imperatives of HRC is to show what that looks like. So can you give us a few examples of ways, both past and present, HRC has met moments like this, and what are some things that individuals can start thinking about if they want to participate?
Absolutely. And I truly believe that even in the midst of moments like this, we are not without hope and we are not without power, especially walking around the halls of this campus. The power is evident and it's real. I think that there are a few things that we're thinking about. The first is safety. Look, immediately after the election, the things that people were reaching out to us about were figuring out how they got identification that matched their gender identity before this new president came into office. They were asking about parentage rights and protecting their family, or how to get power of attorney so that if their partner got sick, they wouldn't be turned away, their support network wouldn't be turned away to the hospital. We got to think about how to meet people's urgent need right now, and it's already happening. I mean, whether, I talked to a parent who for the first time volunteered at a youth LGBTQ plus drop-in center, or the people that are helping to helping folks to get access to their meds across state lines and helping with that process. This is already taking place. And I think the task for us is, how do we help our neighbors to get the tools and resources that they need in the midst of this storm? The second thing is about strategy. So after I think about my neighbor, I got to start thinking about my community and what we can do. And whether you're thinking about your campus community, your workplace, or policy and politic, we have to make our voices heard. I always say, don't sleep on the wins. Y'all, we have already defeated one of Donald Trump's proposed nominees. We got Matt Gaetz out of there, right, before he even made it to a Senate confirmation hearing. We have to take and embrace these wins where we can. Not only that, they tried to get rid of the Tuskegee Airmen content out of Air Force trainings. And we were able to turn that around within a day because people stood up and made your voices heard. Make no mistake, if we are loud, if we push back, if we leverage our power, we can find some victories even in this administration. And in fact, we already have. And the last part that I think about is telling our story. We have to tell ourselves a story that is different than only being, laid out and knocked down. We have to lift up those hero narratives like Pastor Buddy. Did y'all see her the other day at the National Cathedral? She was giving, I think, the invocation or something at President Trump's.
It was a National Prayer Breakfast.
National Prayer Breakfast. Thank you. And she spoke truth to power directly to him, right? There are those opportunities to lift up those hero narratives so that people can feel inspired about what is possible. But we're going to have to do that. And every little action that we take, it adds up to these collective victories.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. And if you don't have any, I'm going to keep making them up. So raise your hand if you have a question. I'm going to need you to introduce yourself and yell out your question because we only have 2 microphones. So.
Hello, my name is Barry Andrews. I'm a freshman in political science, history, double major, international affairs.
You've been here 4 days. How are you doing all of these things?
Okay.
That's what we do at Howard.
Yes.
Good response.
I work at the Partnership for Southern Equity. I have actually for a few years now.
Yes.
And one of our major concerns in just, going through our process in the wake of November, we're trying to figure out how our work is going to be going forward. We're very concerned, with a lot of the federal funding and support probably going to become rolled back. So we're really thinking that a lot of the work that we're trying to do is going to have to become more local, and we're going to have to rely a lot less on help and assistance from the federal level. And I just wanted to get both of your takes on that.
So just to repeat, there are a lot of programs like Partnership for Southern Equity that have relied heavily on federal funding.
And under this administration, those dollars are likely to be slashed or rolled back. And so how do we move forward? For me, you never let a crisis go to waste. And in this moment, we've got to remember that when the partnership started, it had no money. It began trying to respond to the paucity of resources that were delivered in the South to communities that were the most vulnerable. Getting the support, getting the investment is an additive. It is not the intention. And I think sometimes we get used to having stuff, we forget what we did before we had it. I'm constantly reminded that the reason we try to add more, it's to expand what we can do, but the mission that led us to get started doesn't disappear because the resources do. And so the first responsibility is to figure out, how do you replace the resources? What was the cash paying for? Was it to hire people? So then how do you find volunteers who are willing to do maybe less than you want, but more than you have? It is trying to identify other organizations that think that this is what they do too. So often we have a solution and we think we're the only person who's thought of it, or I only want to do it if I get to do it my way. These are moments for coalition building. One of the conversations that Kelley and I had earlier today was about her organization does stuff, my organizations do things. How do we share resources and share ideas to do more together? And so this is a moment for coalition, because in coalition, you're no longer fighting over who gets to get credit. You're working together to make certain that people get services. And I'm not saying PSC fights for credit, but my point is, one of the opportunities here is to really figure out who else is in community with us. What else are they doing, and how can we work together? The third opportunity in this crisis is to determine how effective what you've been doing was. Because often when you are pushed to fewer resources, and I don't know if any of you have ever experienced, you didn't quite get quite as much in that loan check as you thought, and suddenly the things you could afford to do versus what you thought you were going to do changes. Your priorities shift. And this is a moment where we have to reassess our priorities, because battles we thought we'd won have been undone. And so how do we figure out what is the highest and best use of what we do have? It is never as satisfying as having those who help us do the things that need to be done, but not having what you need is not a reason to stop doing what needs to be done. My dad used to say, having nothing is never an excuse for doing nothing. No, did you have? Oh, but that's.
I think you got it.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna go you, and you, and then we'll do some more. And you. Thank you. So yes, ma'am.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dale Page Thomas. I am a first-year junior, political science psychology, double major, African-American studies and criminology, double minor from Wilson, North Carolina, by way of Havana, Cuba. And my question mainly portrays to how Black women have been feeling since the election. Because me personally, when the election happened and I saw the voting demographics, I've seen the majority African-American women voted for Kamala, while white women who said, oh, we got you, we're your sisters and everything, they voted for Trump. And then all this is happening. So my question is, how can we help increase motivation and to help people understand that the world does not hate you, the world still loves you? How can we keep motivation for not just the Black community, but all communities who are under attack to be
Yeah. Well, I haven't quite licked all my wounds on this one yet, let me just tell you. And I also believe we deserve to be pissed off. We showed up for this country. We constantly show up for this country, and yet it doesn't show up for us. So I think that anybody that's pissed off, anybody that's mad about that, you deserve to sit in that rage and in that anger, but you can't stay there. I think for me, the learnings I took away from this election were really about the 36%. The 36% of people that stayed home and did not participate in this election, and why that was. Because at the end of the day, Donald Trump did not win the majority of voters in the United States of America. He does not have a mandate here. He did not do that. The majority of people either voted for Kamala Harris or they stayed home. So I think that there's a question in front of us about the value proposition that we're making around elections. Real interrogation around how candidates are showing up, not just for our communities in years that end with 2, but showing up over and over and over again, and the accountability that happens between cycles. But there are some things that coming after this election, I just wasn't going to accept. And all the aftermath of the election, they want to debate the margins of Black women that did not show up. I can't show up for that conversation. No, ma'am. After this election, they wanted to come for Kamala Harris, who in 100 days tried to do what this country has literally not done in hundreds of years. I can't show up for that conversation. But what I can show up for is understanding that we still have a system of democracy where too many people don't believe that their voice counts or their voice is heard. Even in races where you're seeing us lose states by 20 votes per precinct, or races by 16 or so votes that could change the outcome of a state house race. This is a time where we've got to reconnect with folks and help to bridge that gap between the world as it is and the world as it could be if we all participated. So I, again, want to honor the rage that folks are feeling, but also create space for us to design new ways of political engagement that do center our lives. And honestly, I think that there's no one that's done this better. I don't know if I call you chair or professor or queen goddess or what exactly, but all of it than Stacey Abrams.
I'm very kind. Thank you. So, I will augment this in 2 things. I'm going to say something because I don't want anyone to misquote you. Kelley said Donald Trump did not get 50% of the voters. That is true. He got 49%. She said that Kamala Harris, and if you add together Kamala Harris plus those who did not vote, that is more than the number he got. We are not suggesting that she got more votes because that's how rumors get started. No, you were very clear, but I'd like to clarify. Thank you. But the reason I think what you said is so important, the people who didn't show up, 90 million people did not vote. 90 million people. We don't need all of them because the margin between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump was less than 2 million people. So one thing we can do is start now. We keep waiting for elections to do the work. One of the goals that I've always had is do the work before it needs to be done. And so Kelley earlier said, part of our job is to tell stories. Tell stories now. There are terrible things happening. There are children in Head Start who may not have a place to go next week, which means their parents can't go to work next week, which means their parents lose their jobs next week, which means in 2 weeks from that or 3 weeks from that, they may lose their housing. Tell that story. Use social media, use conversation to humanize the consequences of what's happening and connect the dots. Because often we think people don't vote because they don't care. People don't vote often because they either don't know or they don't think we know. And so one of the opportunities, especially in a place as august and as smart and as capable and as loud as Howard can be, is to start telling the stories now. But don't just tell it to each other. Every one of you is from somewhere else. Tell it to the people who are in somewhere else. Tell it to your friends who could never imagine they could be a student here at Howard. But you become part of how they understand their lived experiences. So use your platforms, and it may feel like it's not big enough, but everything starts small. So start small. If you go from 1 follower to 50 followers, that's 50 times more than you had the day before. Okay? And so use your platform, but tell the stories, tell real stories about what's happening. Raise your hand if you listen to radio, if you even know what radio is. There you go. Okay. You should be calling radio stations. If you don't hear them talking about what's happening, call and ask, why aren't you talking about this? I know the Hilltop is going to do great stories. Make sure you're sharing those stories. People are hungry for sources of news. You all have access to one of the best sources of news on this campus. Make sure people who aren't on this campus know how smart your fellow students are. So we should not underestimate our power. Because individually, yes, we're powerful, but collectively, we are mighty. And that 92% can go up even higher, and we can bring some of our recalcitrant friends along if we take the time starting now to let them know that we need them next time. Okay, it's coming across. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. I'm Keisha, and I'm the parent of a young adult trans person. And so my question is about strategy in our community.
Yeah.
Specifically, the conservative movement, be it called MAGA, whatever you want to label it, they have strategically used anti-trans bits in media to create more of a wedge in brown and black communities, and I'll focus on the black community, by radio, by TV, by conversation, by podcast, etc. I'm wondering what do you both think, and I'm so honored to be here, since you both, what do you both think might be ways that we in our community, large and small, can start to address this use of anti-trans material to educate our people? How can we get them past being vulnerable to it? So that's my
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. Good to see you. Look, I think one of the biggest challenges that our trans community faces right now is a lack of visibility, right? Right now, only 30% of people in the United States believe that they know a trans person. More people think that they have seen a ghost than a trans person. And the challenge is that when there's a lack of visibility for communities, a lack of familiarity, it creates a lot of room where one of two things is going to happen: empathy and curiosity, or fear and confusion. And what our opposition has done is really lean into the spirit of fear and confusion and then pair it with other things that are challenging in people's lives. So during the Trump-Harris campaign, the Trump campaign ran these ads of, do you want your taxpayer dollars paying for transition care for people who are imprisoned? And the challenge there is that the real fear that people have is around how their taxpayer dollars are being used. It's an economic argument, and then they're scapegoating trans people within that. So after the election, we end up in this space where the conclusion sometimes by the establishment in this town is that people don't support trans people. But in reality, that was an economic argument around their concerns about how taxpayer dollars are being spent. Because you could have put any issue in there other than trans people and gotten the same outcome. And I bring that up because I think that there's a lot of work that we have to do to separate fact from fiction. Actually, the majority of people in this country believe that trans people should be celebrated and acknowledged as whatever their gender identity is that they identify as. That's where the majority of Americans are. So we've got to do the work of humanizing and of storytelling so that we make sure that people understand that trans folks aren't someone to be afraid of. Trans people are your Uber drivers. They're giving you coffee at Compass Coffee or wherever you go for coffee. They're your classmates and everyone else, right? So that's the work that we have to do. And I think it's also important to put it in the broader context. If you think about lesbian, gay, and bi folks, this is the same argument that we were having 30 years ago. Because let's remember, the Defense of Marriage Act was the law of the land only, was it 30 or maybe 40 years ago now, right? Where same-sex marriage was considered illegal in this country. However, now here we are 30 or so years later, and the Respect for Marriage Act is the law of the land. And in that time period, we went from about 30% of people believing they knew a lesbian, gay, or bisexual person to having 70% of the country believe that they know someone who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual. That covering that gap, making that shift, humanizing our lives, resulted in change of not only hearts and minds, but also law and policy. So now I think that we're at an important point where we cannot scapegoat any community, and we have to figure out how to tell these stories that humanize our lives and our existence. The last thing I'll say, and I think that this is really on the strategic point, is that if there's another thing that I learned in this election, it's that something has happened over the last several years that really did infuse a deep sense of individualism within people. The idea that if my neighbor's okay and I'm okay, I don't think that that is actually shared as a common belief in too many communities and areas. And I say that because when I bring that into the strategic space, it means that it's not enough for me to just say, everybody needs to have basic rights, because if we don't, you might not. We have to make the direct connection to one community's rights being impacted and what that's going to mean for you and for your family. We saw this play out when a trans sports bill was introduced in the United States House of Representatives a couple weeks ago, but it's a couple days ago. And the way that we got so many votes to make sure to vote that bill down, held every Democrat except for 2, was to actually talk about how to enforce this bill. It's going to mean that cis girls and children are actually exposed to more risks than they were before, especially Black and brown girls who sometimes our womanhood has been within question, right? But making those connections so concrete that people understand the risk is to all has got to be a part of our calculus and our work. And at the end of the day, folks are using LGBTQ plus issues, especially trans issues, to open the door to a variety of ways that they want to harm and discriminate against all of us.
Thank you. So I'm going to finish here and I'm coming back there. So, yep, you were next.
Hi, my name is Charlene, decades removed from Howard, a nonprofit starting with today that does Black liberation and well-being.
Yes.
And my question is to both of you, that you begin to touch on, but you collaborate on what's next. We have 2026 and 2028. How do we get out of this cycle of waiting to the last minute, going to Hail Mary? I would love to hear your best practices. We have like 1 or 2 things, Stacey, that worked in Georgia that we can take to our communities that are like, we're on the ground now beginning to
Thank you. So our first job, and I'm going to take something that Kelley said and expound on it. There is a rising sense of individualism, but that's also because there's a rising sense of scarcity.
Yes.
People are afraid there's not enough to go around, so they've got to get theirs.
That's right.
And so part of our responsibility is to remove the fear of scarcity. Sharing is not hard. We learned it in kindergarten. But we forget just how much it means. And so when we started, in fact, every organization I've ever started, the first question that everyone has to ask is, how can I help? It seems so basic, but people are so afraid that no one cares that even hearing the question opens their willingness to hear and to listen. So instead of starting with why didn't you or how come you wouldn't, starting with how can I help? Because the second question is, what are you afraid of? And that also goes to what Kelley was saying. Part of the scarcity mentality is your fear that what you got is going to be taken away. So you fear you don't have enough and you fear what you have is going to go. And so what we can be doing between now and 26, between now and 28, between now and 30, which is when the next census is, which is going to be the census that really tells the story of the next century, is we have to start asking, how can I help? And what are you afraid of? And then we have to listen. And so nonprofits like yours, you can't solve every problem, but some people, they don't need you to solve their problem. They need someone to know they've got a problem to be solved. They need to know then who could solve the problem. So it's not that they expect you. Partnership for Southern Equity cannot fix every broken life, but they can say, here are the groups that are responsible, because even if federal funds get slashed, there's still taxpayer dollars available. So we're going to tell you where your money went, and we're going to help you go get it.
Yes.
But we've got to do that work, because often it's the technical assistance that people need. It's not that they need you to know they have pain, but they also don't know who's supposed to help them get the problem solved. And so a lot of the work that I do is about setting up entities that can help close the gap. I can't fix it for you, but I can tell you who should. And so, Bill, I love this. This amen. My parents are pastors. Why I can't just preach? That's fine. It's tight. So doing that piece is very important, and keep records of who you talk to, because often when we provide service, our altruism, bless you, our altruism says we're going to do it because it needs to be done, but our strategy says we need to remember who we did it for, so they remember who can help them again. Because every election is about who is going to help you versus who's going to hurt you. And if you don't remind someone that you helped them, they're going to put you in the category of either harm or neutrality. And so we've got to show up before we're needed. And we've got to remind you that we were there for you when you asked. That's how you build. That's what organizing is. That's what effective campaigning is. It's getting people to believe that taking the step of hope and casting a ballot, which is hard. Hope hurts, especially for communities where elections have never yielded real change in their lives that they can discern. If we want to change that dynamic, we've got to show up before we're asked. We've got to listen instead of talk. We've got to deliver. And then we've got to come back and say thank you. And that's the last part. When I do anything, part of our responsibility is to remind people, you did it before, it worked. Thank you for what you did. Let's do it again. Because when you do that, people are now connected to community. You want to overcome individualism? Make sure they feel that if they do this with you, you'll do this with them. And now you've got 2 people, 10 people, a precinct, and now you've got an election. And that's how we can work.
Yeah. Oh, that was good. Yes, I was and clapping over here. That's right. Just a couple things I want to add. One, I think to your point about listening to people. I think too often, especially as a progressive person, we hear people's concerns and we say, oh, no, that's not a concern. Look at this report that tells me something different. You know, especially around the economy, people would say the economy is not working for us and we don't feel like we're thriving in this economy. And we would reply with, well, here's a jobs report. Look what it shows. The jobs grew this month. We got to understand that if people say something is a problem, it is a problem. If people say they're afraid of something, then it is a fear. Our task is to understand where is that fear coming from and what can we do to help? What can we do to open our aperture more? And what can we do to build power together around it? But we've got to understand that the fears and concerns that people have are real, even if we don't understand them. And I think right now, the other thing that we're going to see is an administration that is overreaching. You know, after the election, the most popular Google searches were, 1, what is a tariff? And then the second one was, can I change my vote? So already immediately after the election, people were second guessing the choice that they made as they realized that that choice was not just some sort of verbal posturing, but was the true intention of what they planned to carry out. And now as you see immigration rates happening in places where folks are standing up and saying, I didn't think he meant my community, we got to show them what's happening and who's responsible for the bad stuff. Right now, as federal programs are eliminating school lunches and egg prices are still sky high, we got to tell that story and show the contrast. And we can't wait till we get to an even numbered year. We've got to do that every single day. But that's what it actually means. And I think that, to me, the opportunity of this moment is to really push ourselves to understand that the work of democracy isn't just the work of voting. It's actually the work of building the fabric of our communities. And I think the more that we understand that and lean into it every single day and demonstrate it, that's how we get some of that 36% to realize that voting is only one piece of how we're intending to build our communities together. But as much as this crisis that we're in right now, it breaks my heart and it hurts my soul, I also understand that it's in moments of crisis that transformation actually becomes more possible. So the question is, how can we lean into this moment of disruption to actually rewrite some of the things that we had taken for granted as a society and move not only to reset power in 2020 or in Virginia in 2025 this year, but actually fundamentally change the nature of our elected outcomes.
I'm saying amen, but I'm Methodist, so I do it quietly. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Nyla. I'm a disabled advocate. I'm also a second year MSW student.
Yes.
Almost done. Hey.
All right. Come on.
Most of my advocacy is on social media. Most people know me as your favorite disabled hottie.
Yes.
So my question is, something that I've noticed is like when situations like this happen, disabled people tend to be forgotten.
Okay.
But on my platform, I mostly focus on Black disabled people because I like to talk about the intersectionality of racism and ableism. And something I noticed is that Black disabled people are always forgotten when it comes to situations like this. So my question is, what can I do and what can I say to them so they can be able to have that fight? Because something I noticed is that some of them didn't vote. One for the lack of accessibility, they didn't know how to vote, but also two, they just feel like they always forgotten. And I think that's unfair because disabled people are people, but also Black disabled people matter as well.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
Joan?
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And again, I think we really have to look underneath what these companies are saying out loud, what the administration is saying out loud, and look deeper at the harm that's really being inflicted upon so many of our communities. Just on the company front, for example, you've seen a number of Fortune 500 companies say that they're moving away from their diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments. A lot of them will talk about how they're no longer doing racial justice programming or no longer engaging in things like the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. But then when you read further, right under that, it usually says they're no longer participating in Disability Inc. either, right? We have to understand that all of our fights are intertwined. The other thing that comes to me is thinking about the connectivity of ableism across our world. I mean, most adults will experience being disabled at some point in their lifetime, right? Making sure that people understand these implications. And when you're talking about the ADA and disability policy, you're also talking about pregnancy benefits, right? Like helping people to really understand how connected the policy fights are and the impact to our lives, I think will help. So in this moment, I think that there's a great opportunity for education. And I have to say, I do follow your account. Oh, yes. And what you're doing is storytelling every single day that demonstrates, right, all that is possible and all that's at stake. So that's the kind of work that I think we have to do to continue to make the case that we are stronger together. And at the end of the day, what we are actually building is something that is a vision for this nation that we've never seen, like a multi-generational, a multi-racial, a multicultural movement. For us to do that, we're actually doing some shit nobody has seen before. And I say that because it requires that all of us have a voice at the table and that we're able to innovate and also push one another. So I'm just grateful to you and all that you do too.
Absolutely. So 2 things I'll say. One is that when we hear about the DEI executive orders, they intentionally include DEIA, accessibility. They are intentionally trying to decouple their obligations from having to provide treatment and humanity to the disabled community. And they're doing it because they're companies that don't want to have to abide. And so going back to our earlier conversation, what's your handle? What?
My handle is Nyla NL.
Okay, so everybody needs to follow her. So you're going to say it one more time. Nyla. Nila. The letter N. Morton. Everybody is going to follow her on any platform that she's on, because amplifying her voice, amplifying her stories puts, number one, people in like, why did she jump so high so fast? This is a lot of folks. So if everyone in here agrees to do that, suddenly this is a conversation that we're having. That means she's showing up on For You pages. That means she's showing up in algorithms. But it also means the issues are being raised. Kelley follows you. I think I follow you too. I do a lot of work with New Disabled South, and this is an incredibly important topic because, as Kelley said, we are all connected. When they say diversity, it is all people. That means they don't like any of us.
That's right.
But there are more of us than there are of them. That's why they're mad, because it's been working. Because the Americans with Disabilities Act forced this country for the first time in 1990 to accept and acknowledge the humanity and contributions of disabled people and compel changes in the way we spent our money and lived our lives, and they've been mad about it ever since. But it took until 1990 for this country to say that it wasn't right that members of our community were distanced. When I talk about voter suppression, one of the chief victims of voter suppression laws are the disabled, because they're already facing one of the highest hurdles for access, and this just pushes it even higher. And they do that with intention. And so we have to not just take this seriously. You're all going to say with me, say Nyla.
Nyla.
N. Morton. and find her everywhere. Okay, we got to wrap up. So we got you. Oh, okay. Here's what we're going to do real fast. I know. So we're going to do you. I called on you over there. And then there's one person behind. Yes. But y'all got to go. It's questions. Yeah, we're going to do them all at once. And it's questions, not statements. Go.
Hi, my name is Eunice. I'm a senior. And so I just came back from studying abroad and things like that. And so a lot of the programs that I'm part of, kind of the Center for Research, like AIDS and HIV work and things like that, diversity, together program, all of these things are, of course, seeing budget cuts and are seeing a lot of, very difficult times. And one of the things I really have to ask is, when you talk about meeting people's needs right now, and especially with Medicaid being cut and the foster care industry, and like all of these things, there's a lot of people within this community, myself included, who are trying to be an advocate, of course, but are struggling to kind of live. And so the first question is, one, how do we take care of ourselves, right? But then also, realistically, outside of this room, outside of Howard University, there are things that people being black, having, doing these researches, people just don't care about. So how do you work with, white voices? How do you work with other people who really do have the power? And like with immigration and things like that, I can't find it. I find it very hard to ask, foster youth and things like that to stand up and talk about what they're going through when we just, realize that their $750 checks are being cut because, it's not in the budget this year. It's going to the military budget. And so I think, your responses to that, what you can do moving forward. I know that was like a bunch of questions.
It's okay. We got you. Yes, ma'am. Okay. And yes, ma'am.
Hey everyone, my name is Kennedy Dobson. I'm a freshman major English and Math double minor from Detroit, Michigan. I'm the College of Arts and Sciences freshman president. Looking at history and seeing patterns, Hitler dismantled the government constitutionally within 53 days. Trump has been in office for a little bit over a week. He's already put in 35 executive orders targeting race, religion, etc. What can we do looking at patterns in history from a humanities perspective? We're sitting here. What can we do? There are people all over the world protesting for us, but we're sitting 20 minutes from the Capitol. How can we get other people to really want to do something rather than sit back and watch?
Gotcha. Okay.
You want me to take all those?
We're going to tag team.
Okay. All right. Look, I think the global picture, if I zoom back, is really understanding the urgency of this moment and finding any ways that we can to interrupt what is happening right in front of us. For me, I think, again, I kind of come back to this idea of anticipatory obedience, because if you look at a lot of dictatorships across the world, what actually happens is that dictators and strongmen are able to instill their power across nations because people actually comply before anything is changed. If I think about, the inauguration where I saw the 4 wealthiest men in the world sitting in front of the people who would be in his cabinet, these are things that we should be worried about and afraid of when we think about the institution of our democracy. So the question comes back to, where do we have power that we can start to implement that will make a difference? And also, where do we really ground ourselves in hope? Because at the end of the day, the greatest threat to this nation is if we give up. If we believe that we are not powerful, then we aren't. So I would just give you historical examples, too, that always remind me of what's possible. When we were in the heat of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s, where a whole generation of gay men lost their lives, the way that we fought back around that was creating needle exchange programs in communities, going after predatory insurance companies. We fought back together. We didn't accept death. And together we've created immense progress right now, to the point where if we weren't in this administration, we'd be within reach of ending the epidemic in this generation, our lifetime. That didn't happen because people had a lot of resources. It didn't happen because people were, so healthy and well. It happened because even in the midst of this, we found things that we could do together. So I think as we're thinking about engaging folks, whether it's the immigrant community or foster youth or, young people, they're trying to get by. We don't want to take away the opportunity for them to realize their own power in the little things that we can do. We've got to create opportunities. And especially here in the District of Columbia, there are going to be ways where we can show up in person. Tonight, in fact, there's a rally happening at the White House in opposition to the OMB rules that went out to freeze federal funding. Showing up publicly where we can matters. Making those phone calls to our representatives that represent us, all that stuff matters. And together, we're going to find ways to slow this down. But I do believe that it's going to come down to what are we willing to do? And this is a moment where for us to maintain our ability to build movement, we're really going to have to be in this together because the questions in front of us get to be even more complex, especially with this culture of vigilantism that's being instilled in states across the country, whether it's Texas that's encouraging neighbors to report their neighbors who have gotten abortions out of state, or it's in, oh goodness, that's Texas again, where they're encouraging schools to give up the data of trans youth that are within their communities, or in places where ICE is going to come knocking at our doors. We have to know the laws that are available to us. We have to know our rights, and we can't allow ourselves to comply with things that are unconstitutional.
So I'm going to wrap it up with a few things. One, school of social work. You have an audience of people who understand the importance of what you do. Too often, and this goes, I think, back to the very first question, which I appreciate it. Too often we believe that because we can't do everything, we can't do anything. Or that because we don't have enough, anything we do is insufficient. I believe in the inverse. Anything you do is more than was being done before. And so for those children who are facing having their benefits cut, part of it is telling their stories, get videos of them, unless they're underage. But find ways to tell their stories and put it out there, and don't let the fact that you tell it once and no one listens be a reason not to tell it. In fact, come and talk to somebody who has a huge following on the internet and talk about what you're concerned about, because you want those youth to understand they're not facing this alone. There are other people who are also under attack, but when we unite, we can do more. Ask your colleagues in the School of Social Work to invest. Maybe it's not a lot, but maybe once a week you guys can do a potluck. Like, think about the things that feel small and insignificant. But if you've ever been broke, if you've ever been poor, small is huge. And we forget that sometimes, because once you've seen what more feels like, you like it, which is why we saw a bunch of billionaires bending the knee to an oligarch in training, because they were afraid that they're going to lose. I don't know what they thought they would lose. But their fear of loss of power and loss of access meant that they sublimated themselves before they had to. We don't have to. I like to think that I've lost so much, losing more, what does that mean? Because I know how to survive loss. More importantly, I know how to build gain. And so think about what small things you can do, because yes, this is going to be a long 4 years. But we cannot be overwhelmed by the scope of what's to come. We've got to be energized by the capacity of what we can do. That's the first thing. Unfortunately, because of who is in charge and because of the rescission of the humanitarian pool, there's not much that can be done, except that we have to talk about it. We have to talk about why this happened in the first place. Why were Haitians given asylum? Why were Venezuelans given asylum? And why did he only revoke it for those communities? We've got to tell the story. We can't get caught up in this false narrative about immigration and refuse to acknowledge the history of this country and how it was built. And so while we cannot reverse his behavior, we can talk about why it was necessary in the first place, and why the foundational values of this country said that when you faced harm, when you faced tragedy, when you faced oppression, we were the place to come, and that's the country we need to be again. And the reason the Weimar Republic fell in 53 days was because people were silent, because they thought, well, it's not going to get to me. If it gets to me, it's not going to really change anything. And I don't like those other folks anyway, so I'm going to let you do what you want to them. But the reality is that kind of machine doesn't stop until they get everything. And so part of our responsibility is to talk about what happened. There was a silence in 53 days. There were leaders who did not use their voices because they didn't think there was a consequence for silence. And so we know what happened. Let's make sure that we are talking about it and that we're calling it out. This is not about partisanship. We're talking about the person who works for all of us. Whether you cast your ballot for him or not, he works for all of us. The cabinet he is selecting works for all of us. Every person elected to Congress works for all of us, which means they are obliged to listen and be accountable to all of us. Do not cede your power because you don't think it's real. Use your power until they take it from you and then go and borrow someone else's so you can get any more done. Thank you guys so much for being here today. And please help me thank Kelley Robinson, the head of HRC.